They called it the House of Broken Nannies. 101 had come and gone, all defeated by the same six daughters and their powerful, arrogant father. But one quiet morning, a young woman arrived at the gates, calm, confident, and far more dangerous than she looked. The millionaire, a man named Harrison Vale, believed he'd seen everything. Money, power, control. He had them all. Or so he thought. When the new maid sat across from him in his marble office, he studied her like an object he'd already decided wasn't worth much. Her hands rested quietly in her lap, her expression unreadable. He asked her if she was sure she could handle difficult children. His tone was polite, but every word dripped with condescension. She simply smiled and said she'd handled worse. Children who had lost more than their tempers. He didn't like that answer, so he hired her, convinced she'd fail, just like the others. 3,000 a month. No benefits. He laughed as she left, telling himself she'd last 2 days at most. But what he didn't know was that she hadn't come for the money. She'd come for the truth. When she walked through the mansion's grand doors the next morning, the silence hit her first. It wasn't peace. It was emptiness pretending to be order. The walls were marked with crayon. The rugs were stained. The air carried the heavy scent of loneliness. 6 pairs of eyes stared at her from the staircase. 6 daughters, half curious, half defiant. The oldest girl glared at her as if daring her to run. But the woman didn't flinch. She'd seen grief before, and she recognized it instantly. She started cleaning without a word. The girls watched her, waiting for her to break the way everyone else had. By noon, the house was spotless, but upstairs, muffled sobs echoed through a half-open door. One of the younger girls clutched a picture of her mother, whispering, "I miss you." The woman didn't interrupt. She just whispered softly, "I know," and moved on. Later, she overheard a voice from the study, deep, cold, impatient. The millionaire was on the phone with his mother. "No, she's just temporary," he said. "A girl from the lower district. You know how it is. They don't last long." The maid smiled quietly. Her small recorder had already captured everything. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "Subject, Harrison Vale. 6 daughters. Emotional neglect suspected. Objective, observe, document, expose." Over the next few days, she began to notice everything he ignored. The unopened bills, the unpaid hospital debts, the empty photo frames. The man who looked wealthy was actually drowning, and his arrogance was just the mask of someone terrified to be seen as weak. The children, though wild, weren't cruel. They were hurt. They tested her constantly. Spilled paint, scattered marbles, broke things just to see if she'd scream. But she never raised her voice. Instead, she smiled and said, "You're clever." That was well planned. It threw them off completely. She had learned long ago that children who misbehave aren't bad. They're just trying to say they're in pain. Each night she wrote everything down. Every word, every pattern, every hidden cry for help. And every time the father insulted her, she pressed record. One evening, he brought colleagues to the mansion for drinks, the house filled with laughter, the kind that smells of whiskey and cruelty. One man joked about him hiring a black maid. He laughed and said, "She's cheap and tough." "They can take more upstairs," one of the daughters overheard. She cried quietly until the maid found her sitting on the stairs. "Is he going to send us away?" the child asked. "Not if I can help it," she replied. Days later, the maid's mentor, Nero, a respected psychologist, visited under the guise of a family consultant. She observed the girls' drawings, families with missing faces, houses without doors, empty skies. "This is trauma," the doctor whispered. The maid nodded. "I'm documenting everything, but I need time." "Then give him the rope," the doctor said. "He'll hang himself with it." That night, she placed tiny audio cameras around the mansion. Legal, discreet, and nearly invisible. Soon she had hours of recordings, Harrison shouting at his daughters, mocking their emotions, telling the maid to discipline them physically. Each clip, each word, became another piece of truth he could never buy back. Then came the breaking point. A thunderstorm shook the house, and Harrison stumbled home, drunk and furious. He threw papers onto the table and demanded that she sign them. They were testimonies stating that the girls were unmanageable, dangerous, in need of strict discipline. He wanted to send them away to a boarding school abroad, not for education, but to escape responsibility. When she refused, he exploded. "I pay you to clean, not to think," he yelled. She stood still, unshaken. "No," she said quietly, "you pay me to watch." And I've seen enough that night. She sent every record. By sunrise, the truth was no longer trapped in that house. The next morning, 3 official cars arrived at the gate. When the millionaire opened the door, he found a social worker, 2 legal officers, and the same psychologist who had once walked those halls quietly. He tried to smile, but his voice shook as he asked what was happening. They told him they had received a detailed report of emotional neglect, discrimination, and evidence of verbal abuse. He called it nonsense, until the recordings began to play. His own voice filled the room. "She's cheap. They can take more. Smack them if you have to. Send them away. I can't deal with them anymore." For once, his daughters didn't look afraid. They looked relieved. The maid stood calmly beside the officials, no longer in uniform but in a crisp blazer, holding a folder of documents. She looked at him and said, "My name is Kesha Williams, graduate researcher in child psychology. You didn't hire a maid. You hired your own mirror." He shouted that it was illegal, but she showed him his signed consent. Every recording had been within her rights, as part of an approved research project. He was cornered by his own arrogance. The authorities declared that his daughters would be removed for their safety. He screamed that they were his, but one of the girls, the oldest, finally looked him in the eye and said, "You said we were the problem, but it was you." As the cars drove away with the children, rain fell again, soft this time, washing the lies off the mansion's stone walls. He shouted after her, calling her a traitor, a liar, a nobody. She turned once, meeting his eyes with quiet certainty. "You ruined yourself," she said. "I just gave the truth a voice." The gate closed behind her. Days later, the headlines hit. "Real estate mogul under investigation for child neglect." "Wealthy family torn apart by hidden abuse." Investors withdrew. Partners vanished. The empire collapsed. Months passed, and the daughters began to heal. Therapy replaced fear. Laughter slowly returned to their lives. The woman who had once scrubbed their floors became their counselor, the one person they truly trusted. 2 years later, that same woman walked across a stage at Harvard University. Her thesis on emotional neglect in wealthy families became a national reference. She founded a clinic for children who had been silenced by privilege and neglect. When reporters asked what motivated her, she said simply, "Because I used to be one of them, a child people gave up on." As for Harrison Vale, he lost everything: his company, his fortune, and the image he had built around himself. He lived in a small apartment, working a quiet job behind a desk. On his shelf sat a single photograph, his daughters smiling. They visited him sometimes, not out of obligation, but closure. He would apologize. They would listen. But the space between them never closed. One evening, years later, he attended a charity gala hosted by the Williams Foundation, standing in the back of the room unnoticed. On stage, she spoke with grace and calm power. "Justice isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about rebuilding what others tried to break." The audience applauded. He didn't. He just watched, realizing that the woman he had once dismissed as unworthy had become everything he could never be. When she left the stage, their eyes met for a brief moment. She smiled, not with triumph, but with peace, and he understood. Sometimes the loudest revenge isn't destruction. It's success, it's healing, it's becoming the proof that goodness, no matter how underestimated, always wins. Music swells softly, then fades to silence. Because in a world full of Harrisons, we all need a little more Kesha, the quiet kind of strength that turns pain into purpose and truth into power.